The BMW X5 and the Porsche Cayenne represent two of our very favorite two-row premium SUVs. These are our top picks in their class, and in this video, we're going to put them up against one another to determine which one is the king of the premium family hauler. We're going to be talking about fuel economy, interior usability, interior cargo capacity, noise levels, audio tests. We're going to take them both for a drive and then compare them from a technical perspective in the shop. Let's start with the Porsche Cayenne before Mark walks you through my beloved BMW. This is a 2024 model, which means it's the mid-cycle refresh. The price has grown, but you get more standard features. This is the V6 model, which represents the vast majority of Cayennes sold. Cayennes definitely attract a more premium or wealthy buyer. Their household income and average income is probably much higher than that of the BMW X5 buyer. But when it comes to the two examples we are testing, this Cayenne is $96,000, with the BMW X5 is tested or spec'd out to $84,000 and some change. They are remarkably close to one another. When it comes to interior usability, despite these vehicles essentially being the same physical footprint, there is quite a big difference in interior storage, specifically the trunk with the rear seats down. The Cayenne, unfortunately, is the much smaller SUV, and the rear seats up, it's also a little bit smaller. When it comes to actual usability though, the door pockets in the Cayenne are quite good. A full-size Nalgene bottle will fit in them. There's good interior storage throughout. I actually feel like this is a very well laid out SUV for what it is. Mark's gonna get into some of the finer usability details between both vehicles though. As far as updates for 2024, much like in the new 911, along with basically every other Porsche product, they've ditched the old analog tack in its place as a digital display. Love it or hate it, this is the direction Porsche's going for. This has Porsche's latest infotainment system, and I will say this is something where Porsche is definitely behind BMW in. Their infotainment software, at least this version of it that we've tested, has had some problems with stability. It would not pair to our Bluetooth audio testing, and this is one of the few cars that's ever been a problem. And I will tell you, just listening to it, and in the past, the Bose system is tested reasonably well, and this is without a doubt a quieter vehicle than the BMW X5. But it is still telling that the software, despite being wireless Apple CarPlay, Android Automotive, is not as good as what is found in the BMW. However, when it comes to the usability of this interior space, it's far less gimmicky. There's a lot less screens to hop through. Drive modes are centralized to the steering wheel, easy to understand. They're easy to customize to the head unit. All your HVAC controls are physical. And the other thing I will bring up as well is this interior space feels more expensive. Everything feels more solid, the body feels more solid, all the touch points feel more expensive. And if you care, you can fully customize out the Porsche Cayenne to be nearly anything you want in the configurator, where the BMW X5 sort of more pigeonholes you into specific options. This feels like a more boutique product, one, however, that doesn't necessarily have the same level of interior technology and interior usability. All comes down to what you prioritize in your luxury SUV. So with that, let's have Mark explain to you the BMW X5's pros and cons.
Now we all know Jack is Mr. Porsche. You can put a Porsche badge on a porta potty and they make excuses for it. And this is where the BMW has a few advantages because they have an X for everything. They have X1 through 1000. They have more CUVs, SAVs, SUVs than they know what to do or have the right to make. And what this has done, for better or worse, is given them a great idea of how to blend sportiness with a hauler and vice versa. And the X5 is the perfect blend of all that. From the outside, that looks very cohesive. It's still a bit boxy, more traditional, without going off the deep end of some of the newer BMW styling. It really does look good, namely when you sit it next to a Cayenne. It looks far more aggressive. Now, the interior space where you're going to spend most of your time is really, really well thought out. Now, granted, this received a mid-cycle refresh where they changed over to their corporate threaded screen, which this interior was designed not around that. It used to have a screen more integrated into the dash. Not as well as the Porsche, of course, but they got rid of that and just plastered the screen here. And the problem is it looks really generic and tacked on. And the way that the dash slopes to the right makes the wheel look almost like it's tilted one way because of the way the dash is angled. So there's some cohesion this is lost where the Porsche has a clear advantage, and the fact that they got rid of all the HVAC controls that are physical, with the exception of the basics of defrosters or defoggers. So that's one of the most frustrating parts. Conversely, the interior technology, namely the infotainment, is some of the best in the business. I can't imagine how much they are paying their software and integration division to get this type of system done, because they are so far ahead of most brands. The problem is they never stop to ask, just because we can do it doesn't mean that we should. And this is a perfect example when you over-integrate too many core functions into the infotainment. When you look at the menu structure, it reminds me a lot of old Windows, where you just go to control panel and there's endless settings that is so convoluted to navigate to that you're forced into making this top drag down bin your shortcuts of where you're going to use it, and just getting around is a nightmare. Even using the search function is not that great. However, the software in terms of speed and processing power annihilates the Porsche, where the Porsche gauge cluster lags when you switch screens or you try to get around menus and animations. The Porsche is way worse than this. So BMW has a huge advantage in this area, also in the safety suite, which we'll talk about in the drive. Things like the cup holder design in the door, where you can just put it straight down, where the Porsche is kind of angled forward. It's harder to get at things. The back seats, while the back seat space in the X5 isn't as good as the Porsche, there's not as much legroom, they give you more cargo capacity in the back of the X5. You can just tell right away opening them up and putting things in here. The X5 is a far more usable hauler with the seats down. The other details are you can put the back seats down in the X5 with rear releases without having to open up both the rear passenger doors and trying to pull the handle to put the seats down. It's like common sense, like things like this, that the BMW does much better. The other thing is there's no HVAC controls in the Porsche that we're testing for $95,000, and there's only a center vent, where the BMW has individual HVAC controls in the back with seat heaters, and they have vents in the center and the side, and that's a big deal if you're putting car seats or have kids in the back. It's a major miss on the Porsche for the price range. Again, there's the difference in like, well, people aren't buying it to be a hauler, but I'd argue the Cayenne is their biggest car at this point. So these are the little important things that you're going to notice. You can split the differences in other areas in terms of the center console cup holders about as usual, the storage space in terms of, you know, where you can put your phone in the armrest. They're a little bit different here or there, but overall, I think the Porsche does a better job in terms of keeping legacy physical controls and keeping the infotainment more simple to use, although it's way slower. But the BMW finds the better middle ground, and that's the big difference between these two cars. Now, if you're looking to do your brat summer, the audio system in this BMW, the Harman Kardon, audibly, it's okay. It's a little bit on the bass heavy side, and I will say around 220 hertz, there is a lot of harmonic distortion, and you'll see a 20 dB dip in the frequency response there. So you have this bass elevation, and then you have this kind of crash down point at 200 hertz, and it does seem very kind of muddled in the mid-range. The bass seems to overtake it. There might be some rattling or resonance in the cabin, and you feel like the bass doesn't have a particular good dissipation effect compared to the Porsche, but in terms of bass response, it's still very bass heavy in my ear, a little bit less than the Porsche. So if you're big into, you know, grilling and jamming your electronic music in the summer, this does a good job at that. But other than that, the frequency response kind of levels out at the higher end, and it is a pretty neutral system overall. But we're gonna head into the shop. We're gonna talk about some Porsche stuff before we talk about the X5.
In the shop with the BMW X5 and Porsche Cayenne V6. Now, from a high-level perspective, Mark, the reason we put both of these together are not only are they our favorite premium SUVs, is they're kind of similar if you think about it. They're both, you know, multi-link front and rear, largely aluminum, premium SUVs that are similar sizes, and both 6 cylinders. Let's talk about this Cayenne first. This is a 2024. This is an E3.2, meaning the mid-cycle refresh. I did a very long video talking about all the engineering BS on that car. It was a Cayenne S, but a lot of the technical details carry over to the base car. This is the V6, multi-link front and rear. This is an MLB Evo, which is Porsche VW Group's rear-biased all-wheel drive architecture for premium SUVs. In this car's case, it is on air springs. So For this generation, all Cayennes come with adaptive dampers. They call it PASM. They've gone from a 1-valve to a 2-valve damper, meaning they can now separate compression and rebound, giving this better overall ride quality. For the air springs that are on this car, which is obviously an option that you're paying a couple grand for, yes, you get adaptive height and all of that, but they went from a 3-chamber to a 2-chamber air spring. Now that's because it can react faster, deflate and inflate quicker, and with the more premium damper they're using, it's just an overall more capable system. This car also has optional rear steer, something you cannot get on the X5, that greatly helps in initial turn-in, but from a practical perspective, if you don't worry about limit handling, what it's really doing is tightening your turning radius. It makes it feel like a more maneuverable car in parking structures. Towing wise, this tows a lot. It tows 7,700 pounds, which is very impressive for this size of SUV. And when it comes to drivetrain, this is VW Group's single turbo 3-liter V6. This makes more horsepower than it used to. It's up like 13 horsepower and like 36 foot-pounds of torque. That's all software, and just like the BMW, this uses a ZF 8-speed automatic. You've got a variety of different wheel options for this car, unlike the M Sport BMW that we're going to talk about here in a second as well.
So you think you were right?
All right, Mark, it's time to talk about a vehicle powered by Christ's engine, the BMW X5.
Before we do that, I want to say a big thank you to James Orton. He is a big supporter of us. He works for Anderson BMW in Crystal Lake. He also supplied us with Mazdas in the past to fill in the gaps. And we don't have a relationship with BMW Germany, their engineering, so we have to wing it oftentimes. But to our reps' credit, they do let us off the leash so we can talk very honest about these products, but we just have to do some of our own research. Also, because we couldn't get a press car that was a 6-cylinder, James gave us a car that was perfectly spec'd out for this comparison. So if you have any questions about BMW or Mazda and you live in Illinois, hit up James.
He's a stand-up lad.
He is actually one of the most honest people in this industry. He's just a good guy. Everybody says the same thing. So thanks, James. Check out his YouTube channel. But in terms of the X5 compared to the Cayenne, there's one key difference. They split up 2 trims. You get the inline-6 version or the V8, and that's how they separate all the features. It's far less customizable than the Cayenne. The Cayenne, you could go well into the $150,000 price point, so there's just a bigger spread. The other thing is the Cayenne is on MLB Evo, which you talked about, which doesn't have to be so many different things. It has to be a pure luxury product, where BMW has to take CLAR, which is what the X5 is built on, and it has to be modular to be so many different things, like sedans, SUVs, and they have so many products they have to scale it out to. So if it's one disadvantage, it's that. But when you look at the underbody, it has more coverings. There's a skid plate, the transmission case is covered up. It's far more, well, at least appearance-wise, looks far more covered up and aerodynamic. Suspension, they both share the similar things, double wishbone or multi-link front and rear. They only swap one thing, whereas the Cayenne gets an aluminum front subframe, the BMW gets a steel one, but the BMW gets an aluminum subframe in the rear. The key differences here is in the 40i, you can't get rear steer, you can't get adaptive sway bars, and you can't get 4-wheel air suspension. You can only option the rear air springs for load leveling. That has nothing to do with ride quality.
The other thing to talk about is, on paper at least, these are pretty similar. They weigh nearly the same, high 4,000 pound range for these specific trim levels, and they're essentially the same length, 194 inches. I think the X5 is technically a couple tenths longer, but the other thing I'm going to talk about is towing, where the Cayenne tows 7,700 pounds. According to BMW, the X5 tows 7,200. Honestly, in the real world,
you're not going to notice them.
You're not going to notice
They're so similar in their missions, and I think that's why it's a very interesting comparison. They're packaged differently. Their philosophies and chassis tuning are different, but they're trying to get at the same point. And I think that's going to be the interesting part about driving this car, Jack.
There's a little difference, though, Mark.
Well, yeah, I know. I was trying to avoid it. Tell me what the big.
Have you heard of this little 6-cylinder engine from Germany? It's called the B58.
The B58 engine continues to deliver industry-leading dynamic performance using cutting-edge design and material strategies. Divine intervention would be required to surpass this modern marvel of engineering.
I struggled in the Cayenne to get north of 20 miles per gallon combined. In the X5, you're sitting in the mid-20s. On the highway, you can get almost 27 miles per gallon. And while the fact that they share the same engine, while they share the same family of gearbox, the calibration in the BMW is
different.
Yes,
and we're going to talk about that in the drive too. I'm sure I'm not going to stop hearing about the B58 for the next 3 days.
Acura Toyota christened it as God's engine as well, Mark. And if it's good enough for Takumi, it's good enough for me.
Get it up, but you got to get it up, get it up. You got to get it up.
I'm home, Mark. Yet another Porsche product. This time it's the V6 Cayenne base model.
I want to hear how it sounds. Whoa!
Like,
jeez. The shit is like...
All right, right off the bat, as much as I like Porsche's drivetrain tuning, this V6 is not in the same category as my B58, Mark.
Why is that?
A couple reasons. Yes, this is technically quicker from 0 to 60. Real world acceleration, this is a faster car from a dig than the X5. But this does not get anywhere as near the fuel economy. The trans tuning is not as good. And honestly, in-gear acceleration in the X5, at least to my feel, when I'm in the car driving that thing around, I feel like that engine does a much better job. So you get 3 or 4 miles per gallon better in the X5. It just feels more powerful more of the time. No one's doing launch control from a dig in their regular family SUV, and it feels more powerful. However, what this thing does better than nearly anything we've ever driven is ride. This thing, it has probably one of the best ride qualities of any two-row premium SUV that I've ever been in.
Any other than the Audi Q7?
Well, honestly, I think compared
Q5?
to the Q7 and Q5, talking to some of the Porsche engineers, there's this perception that they're the same. They're not. When it comes out, as we have an ambulance coming by, probably here.
I'm surprised he's not gonna show up when you drive the X5, that B58.
While the basic hardware is very similar, the fine tuning when it comes to the software is very, very different.
Yeah.
I think they do a really good job between ride quality in this car and body control. Not only does this ride softer than the X5, it has better body control than the X5. And while I will say it is unfair, technically, that this base Cayenne can option and rear steer, that's not something you can even do on a 6-cylinder Cayenne. You can't do it.
A 6-cylinder BMW, you mean?
Sorry, 6-cylinder, BMW. Yeah. My apologies.
Yeah, and it does make a massive difference when you're going back to back between these two. You realize how much the rear steer shrinks down the car, and the air ride in this definitely makes it far more supple. You have a better range of that adjustment from sport to just comfort.
Yeah.
And the X5 is just, it's got adaptive dampers, but I will say, coming from an X7 that has air ride and has rear steer, yes, the rear steer makes a big difference, but it does not ride anywhere near this, even with the air ride. BMW doesn't have the chassis refinement that this brand has, and their knowledge of how to tune dampers, the damper choice and the valving, and their spring rates, bars, all of that, it always feels solid in a Porsche compared to a BMW. And that's not to say BMW is bad.
No.
Because I had this conversation with you. If you didn't drive them back to back,
you would have no idea.
You'd have no idea, and you'd be like super happy with the X5 on like a back road or on the highway. But this car in isolation is isolated.
It's at least, I think, 10 to 15% worse riding in the X5 than it is in the Cayenne.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And even being fair to Porsche and BMW, this is definitely, if you value ride refinement and isolation and body control and nimbleness over everything else, this is better than the X5. I would say that. And the other thing, going back to your transmission discussion, the transmission refinement in this is far worse.
It's much worse.
It doesn't matter what drive mode you're in. It's far more clunky. There's G-shock between shifts, where BMW, like even manually controlling the transmission, you don't get G-shock. In this car, even in automatic mode, there's G-shock, there's stuttering, there's like this vibration that comes from it. And then when you're in that higher sports setting, in automatic or manual, the gear shifting is, I wouldn't want to say reluctant, but it lacks refinement, and it shifts speed and shift parameters.
It doesn't feel anywhere as good as it did in the Cayenne SV6 that we drove in the past, or the Cayenne SV8. I don't know what the cal is for this particular 6-cylinder with this 8-speed, but it's not on the same planet as some of their more performance-oriented vehicles. The last thing I want to bring up before we hop into the BMW is the thing that this brand does very well in every single car that they have, better than BMW, is the cohesiveness between all the inputs. The steering, the throttle linearity, the brake pedal feel, all feels very well integrated together, where you don't think about any of the inputs of this vehicle. It just comes across as very, very natural, which is honestly hard to do in a big SUV, right? Porsche and BMW is trying to figure out how to get this two-row SUV to replace the sports sedan, and it largely has.
Yes.
Because it has to replace the sports sedan, it has to basically defeat physics and get in and out of corners, maintain mid-corner stability, feel nimble, and also ride exceptionally well. And I do think of all of the luxury SUVs we've ever driven, the Cayenne and the X5 are probably some of the best that we've experienced.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're splitting hairs between these two vehicles of like, oh, one's better than the other. They're both tremendous at what they do. And you said this, and I cut it out of my last video, but with the sports sedan or sedans disappearing and cars becoming more expensive, even luxury products, this has to do
More things.
It has to do everything. And it has to be that vehicle, like you were saying, you have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of time, and your only fun you get is on your commute. What do you want to spend your time in? And this is like the answer to that. In basically from comfort to driving like an idiot, it does all of it, and it still hauls, which is hard to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've already talked about the pros and cons in the interior segment.
Yeah.
So, Mark, hit me with that sweet, sweet inline six. I don't want any of this V6 garbage. You hear that, Mark? You hear that balance? Inline six, single turbo.
Oh, she sounds good. Listen to that. I don't know why you would even talk about Porsche when you got this engine revving up. And Jack, people are not going to be driving the X5 or the Cayenne like monkeys, although you probably could. Let's get into why this SUV is dominant in some cases. And we'll start with, let's talk about the engine and the drivetrain, or the drivetrain, engine, and of course the transmission programming.
Of a mainstream non-hypercar supercar, the ZF 8-speed with BMW's calibration and the B58 is probably one of the best drivetrains on the market. It gets good fuel economy, it makes excellent power, it's smooth, there's no herky-jerkiness.
It's reliable.
It's very reliable.
Yeah.
They don't cost a lot to keep on the road. This 48-volt system means the stop-start, which isn't bad in the Porsche.
It's way smoother
here.
here.
It's way smoother here.
It's completely integrated into the car, more so you notice it on a roll.
Yeah.
There's, I think, the finer details of the drivetrain, so shockingly, compared to a Porsche, because Porsche really does a good job with that. This is definitely a highlight of it.
Yeah, it really, other than the packaging, which you've talked about from an interior segment, and the fact that you are paying less money for this car,
yes,
substantially less money. That's the highlight of the vehicle. It is the drivetrain. Great fuel economy, great power, no herky-jerkiness. It feels honestly more expensive than the drivetrain that's in the Porsche. The thing that does let it down, though, and it's the thing that lets down all BMWs these days, is I don't feel that this is that well integrated with all of the inputs for the car. The steering, while it is very fast, and yes, this doesn't have rear steer, I don't feel like necessarily melds with your brain as well when it comes to one-to-one inputs.
But it's funny enough, it feels slower in here when you get out of the Cayenne back-to-back with the rear steer, because the rear steer, shrinks it down so much that you do feel like there's more steering effort or turning effort to get this thing to get the directional change. Whereas the Porsche is very quick, reactive and quick to turn in. This doesn't have that. It feels slower. And even with the 22-inch wheels and tires on here, you would think it'd be like more razor sharp, but it's not.
You have two 75s in the front, 315s in the back, which is hilarious in a vehicle like this.
So again, we said this in the other one, there's not really a bad choice. There's just the differences in philosophy and priorities, right? I think the other thing that this does exceptionally well compared to the Porsche is the safety suite. Yes. When we're talking about BMW software, their budget for software, their software development team, including the safety system, in my approximation and testing it, is definitely in a different class to the Porsche software. And I had an event earlier where during a left-hand turn, much like we're doing here in the Porsche, the car freaked out and saw a car oncoming that wasn't there, and it slammed on the brakes in the middle of the road. And I don't have as many ghost issues or weird software bugs with this vehicle, and I've driven BMWs before, where you really trust the safety suite in this car 90% of the time. Whereas the Porsche, it's very invasive to me compared, even when you have most of it off.
It's invasive, but less good at letting you autopilot the car,
Right.
which is odd. Like the lane keep in this works very, very well. If you do the Traffic Pro assistant stuff when you're in stop and start, you basically take your hands off the wheel below 45 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Does a good job.
It does really well. And I mean, honestly, you could sit in stop and go traffic in this thing and not think about it. At first, once you get over it, it really does work. The lane change assist, where it's integrated into that, it really does a good job lane changing for you without you having to do it. And these are the little things that matter in a car that you're using every day, less in a sports sedan or a sports car experience where you don't care about all that.
No, you don't care at all.
Because you're living on the highway, right? Like, what are the things that you want out of these cars that are important? And I think some of the things that are critically important to the daily driving experience, the BMW has definitely got an edge up on the Porsche product.
I don't disagree with you as much as I am John Porsche when it comes to this stuff. I think when you do get on a back road, though, the ride, as I mentioned, is not as good. It's not as quiet. You know, regardless of what the testing says, to my ear, in the Porsche, it feels immediately quieter. When we did other tests in the past, you know, dB measurements aren't always necessarily telling the entire story.
Right.
But the Porsche feels like a more refined car when you're on the highway.
Yeah, and the decibel readings are misleading, and we really didn't explain this before, but if we took a peak decibel reading right now, the Porsche probably would be quieter.
Yeah.
But the main thing is there's not just the peak frequency, it's the frequencies that are let in that you don't see on a meter. You have to look at the overall response. And the BMW lets far more frequencies from the road and oscillations from the suspension in all over the place. So while that peak number may be close between the two cars, this is noisier all over the place in low frequency, high frequency, and you can tell on this same road with the broken pavement, there's far more jounciness in
You're
the
in
suspension.
comfort in both cars currently.
Yes.
Or were, yeah.
And there's far more vibration and oscillation that doesn't, it's not damped out. So once you hit a bump, you feel it throughout the whole body in this car that doesn't dissipate as quickly as the Porsche did. And that's where you were telling me earlier, you know, if you were on a 400 or 500 mile road trip with your family, you would rather be in the Porsche on those long trips than this. And I would agree with you 100% in isolation when you're driving both back to back, but I'd say the Porsche is 25% better than this car in that regard.
In dynamics.
But if you didn't drive the Porsche, this is an amazing car that eats up the highway miles as well.
This is night and day better than almost everything else in its class. We've purposely for this test picked our two favorite premium rear-wheel drive based SUVs that are non-EV.
So it boils down to this, Jack. Like, what do you value? And I think that's a great discussion for the final thoughts.
All right, sir, let's do it. Show me some B58. Final thoughts on our BMW X5 versus Porsche Cayenne comparison test. First off, huge thanks to our friend James Orden, who works at Anderson BMW Mazda of Crystal Lake. If you're looking for a vehicle, we highly suggest you hit him up. Our Porsche reps, Calvin, Luke, and Frank, for providing us technical support. And of course, our title sponsor, Bridgestone Tires. So if you're looking for tires for your own SUV, we highly suggest you look at the Bridgestone Alenza. These are tires I run on my own family car, as well as Mark runs them on our lovely Nissan Murano Cross Cabriolet. So what about these two SUVs? Well, first off, as I've mentioned already, these are two of our very favorite products, and honestly, you can't go wrong with either of them. However, in this specific test, it's a question of head versus heart. Are you looking at this purely objectively, looking at value, family practicality, or are you looking at this from a product you want to drive and get behind the wheel of? In the case of the Cayenne, of these two vehicles, it is the heart purchase. It costs a lot more money. It's not a value purchase. It's not as usable from an interior perspective, but it does drive better. It rides better, it's quieter, it has better body control, and all of the inputs are more natural. The interior space feels more premium, more of the controls are physical, there's less gimmicks when it comes to the interior electronics, and it feels like a truly boutique luxury product. You can customize this thing to be nearly anything you want as long as you're going to pay for it. Its cons are, unlike the X5, it doesn't do some of the family things as well. That comes to the head or brain purchase. The X5 is, in this test case, essentially $12,000 less, which is a lot of money. It's bigger, does some of the family SUV things better. It gets better fuel economy. The drivetrain is far superior. Jokes aside, the B58 is better than this 3-liter V6 behind me in the Cayenne. It gets better fuel economy, transmission is better calibrated, the mild hybrid system, which we didn't talk too much about in the shop, leads to much better stop-start operation. The X5 has much better interior electronics. The safety suite works better. It's easier to recommend the X5 due to the value side of things. But having both of these side to side, I find myself gravitating to driving the Cayenne. But again, it's personal preference, so I will leave that up to you. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you again soon.